The next day dawned gray, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. The familiar warmth of the morning sun was muted, diffused through clouds that hadn't been there the night before. Even the air felt wrong, heavy and thick, despite the arid landscape surrounding us. We packed up in silence, each casting wary glances toward the cliffside where the petroglyphs waited, their ancient markings somehow darker against the pale stone than they'd been yesterday. Marissa hadn't said a word since the night before. Her usual bright energy, the enthusiasm that had made her one of my best graduate students, was gone, replaced by something hollow and distant. Her face was gaunt, her eyes red and unfocused, like someone who'd seen something they couldn't forget and didn't want to remember. Each time she looked at the cliff face, she would flinch and look away quickly, as if afraid of what she might see if she stared too long. The archaeological expedition had seemed simple enough at first. 3 weeks of documenting previously undiscovered Native American rock art in a remote part of the Sonoran Desert. As the lead archaeologist, I'd chosen this site carefully, intrigued by satellite images showing unusual geometric patterns in the cliff faces. Marissa and Gabe, my 2 most promising doctoral candidates, had jumped at the chance to join the research team. Now I wished I'd never brought them here. By midday, exhaustion had settled deep into our bones. The weight of what we'd experienced the night before pressed down on us like a physical thing. Gabe moved through the motions mechanically, his movements jerky and uncertain. I caught him flinching whenever the wind picked up, like he was afraid the whispers would return. Those terrible, impossible whispers that had filled the night air with promises and threats we couldn't quite understand. But the whispers didn't return. The silence, somehow, was even worse. As the sun rose higher in the pewter sky, I began to try to rationalize what had happened. This land was dry and empty, full of heat and haze and strange noises that bounced off the cliffs, making it easy to believe we weren't alone. Sound played tricks out here. I'd studied enough desert archaeology to know that. The landscape distorted perception. I could convince myself of that much. We were tired, dehydrated perhaps, our minds playing tricks in the isolation of the desert. But then Marissa spoke, her voice weak and hoarse, shattering my attempts at rationalization. "They want us gone," she said, barely above a whisper, and I noticed she was staring at the petroglyphs again, her eyes wide and haunted. Her hands trembled as she pointed, and I saw that her fingernails were broken and bloody, though I couldn't remember her hurting them. "Who wants us gone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, to be the rational professor I was supposed to be. But my voice shook despite my efforts. Marissa didn't answer directly. She just pointed to a section of the cliff we hadn't documented yet. At first, it looked like any other set of carvings we'd been studying. Lines and spirals etched into the rock, faintly darker than the surrounding stone. But as I stared, something about them seemed wrong. The lines twisted in unnatural ways, forming shapes I couldn't quite make out. Faces, maybe, or hands reaching out toward us. The longer I looked, the more the patterns seemed to shift, to change, to become something else entirely. I felt a strange pull, like something in the stone was calling me, trying to drag me closer. The patterns began to swirl and dance, and I could swear I heard something, a faint humming perhaps, or the echo of distant voices. My vision blurred, and I had to tear my eyes away, my pulse racing, sweat cold on my skin despite the desert heat. "We're leaving," I said, my voice coming out more like a gasp. "Now." Gabe nodded, his face pale beneath his tan, and we hurried to pack the last of our equipment. Our careful archaeological documentation was forgotten in our haste to get away. Marissa didn't protest, but as we started down the trail, she kept glancing over her shoulder, her gaze drawn back to the cliff, as if some part of her was still there, still listening to whatever voices we'd heard in the night. We made it about a mile down the trail before Gabe stopped short. He stood there, staring at something on the ground, his face twisted with confusion and growing horror. "What is it?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended, fear making me harsh. He didn't respond, just pointed. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop, the world tilting sideways beneath my feet. There, in the dusty soil, were footprints. Not just any footprints. They were ours. The same tracks we'd left on the way up, clear and distinct in the dry earth. But they were facing the wrong direction, as if we'd somehow doubled back without realizing it. "No," I whispered, shaking my head in denial. We didn't turn around." "We didn't," Gabe said, his voice shaking. "I know we didn't. I've been watching the sun. We've been walking east, away from the cliffs. These tracks, this isn't possible." Panic clawed at my throat as I looked around, trying to orient myself. But the desert stretched out in every direction, endless and featureless, and the cliffs loomed behind us like silent sentinels, watching our every move. The sun seemed to have moved wrong in the sky, casting shadows that pointed in impossible directions. "Let's go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, to be the leader they needed. "We'll just retrace our steps. We'll find the trail." But as we walked, the landscape began to shift around us. The ground seemed to tilt and sway beneath our feet, and the cliffs loomed closer, even though we were moving away from them. I felt as though we were walking in circles, trapped in some twisted maze with no way out. The very air seemed to thicken, making each step harder than the last. The whispers returned then, soft and insistent, calling my name over and over. "Dr. Collins, come back. See." They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air with their terrible promise. Gabe clutched his head, his face twisted with pain, and Marissa just stared blankly ahead, her eyes dull and unfocused. I tried to shut out the voices, tried to focus on the path ahead, but the whispers grew louder, filling my mind until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. And then, suddenly they stopped. I blinked, disoriented by the sudden silence, and found myself standing at the base of the cliff, staring up at the petroglyphs. We were back where we'd started, though we'd been walking away for what felt like hours. "No," I whispered, shaking my head in denial. We were walking away. We were going down the trail. But the cliff loomed above us, silent and unyielding, and the petroglyphs seemed to pulse in the fading light, their shapes shifting and twisting, forming strange alien patterns that made my head ache just to look at them. They weren't the simple geometric shapes and animal figures we'd come to study. They were something else entirely. Something older. Something wrong. Marissa let out a low, broken sob, and I turned to see her staring at the cliff, her face pale and streaked with tears. "They won't let us leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They want us to stay. Forever." Night fell, cold and merciless, and the desert around us seemed to close in, trapping us beneath the shadow of the cliffs. We huddled together, our backs pressed against the rock, as the darkness deepened and the stars appeared, cold and distant in the sky above. But even the familiar constellations seemed wrong, arranged in patterns I'd never seen before. The whispers began again, louder this time, filling the air with a cacophony of voices. They called our names, over and over, each voice overlapping with the next until it was impossible to tell them apart. They spoke in languages I'd never heard, ancient tongues that had no business being spoken in the modern world. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but the voices seemed to seep into my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. I could feel them inside me, twisting and writhing, digging into my memories, my fears, my regrets. They knew everything about me, every doubt, every failure. every dark thought I'd ever had. And then I saw it. A figure, pale and ghostly, standing at the edge of our dying firelight. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden in shadow, its eyes empty and hollow. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching us with a cold, unblinking gaze that seemed to pierce straight through to our souls. Marissa let out a choked gasp, and I realized she could see it too. She clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my skin, her face twisted with terror. What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the whispers that filled the air. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what it was, only that it was wrong, that it didn't belong in this world. It was something ancient, something malevolent, something that had been waiting in the darkness for centuries, waiting for us to come, to trespass, to disturb its rest. And now, it was awake. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, its hollow eyes locked onto us. I could feel its gaze, cold and relentless, boring into my soul, stripping away every layer of protection, every defense. I could feel it peeling me open, exposing every fear, every doubt, every regret. Each step it took seemed to drain the warmth from the air, until even our breath froze in our lungs. I wanted to run, to scream, to escape, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. I was trapped, frozen in place, helpless in the face of its terrible power. The petroglyphs on the cliff face behind us began to glow with a sickly light, casting twisted shadows that danced and writhed like living things. Gabe let out a strangled cry, and I turned to see him clutching his head, his face contorted with pain. He fell to his knees, his body racked with convulsions, and I realized with horror that the figure was inside him, tearing him apart from the inside out. His eyes had gone black, empty, like the thing that watched us. Marissa screamed, a high, keening sound that echoed off the cliffs, and the figure turned its gaze on her, its empty eyes narrowing with a twisted, malevolent hunger. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could see darkness beginning to seep from the corners of her eyes. I grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet, and we ran, stumbling blindly through the darkness, the whispers chasing us, growing louder and louder, until they filled the air with a deafening roar. Behind us, I could hear Gabe's screams turning into something else, something inhuman. I don't know how long we ran, only that the whispers followed us, relentless and unforgiving. The desert stretched out before us, endless and empty, and the cliffs loomed behind us, dark and silent, a constant reminder of the horrors we'd left behind. Time seemed to lose all meaning. We might have been running for hours or days. We finally collapsed, gasping for breath, our bodies bruised and battered, our minds shattered by the terror we'd endured. When consciousness returned, we found ourselves on the edge of the desert, the cliffs a distant memory, their dark shapes fading into the morning light like a half-remembered nightmare. Marissa didn't speak. She just stared into the distance, her eyes empty, her face pale and drawn. Gabe was gone, lost to the darkness, his body claimed by the figure that had haunted us, that had followed us, that had refused to let us go. I knew somehow that he was still there, among the petroglyphs, his essence added to the ancient whispers that haunted those cursed cliffs. We made our way back to civilization, our bodies broken, our minds scarred by the horrors we'd witnessed. The university accepted my report about the tragic climbing accident that had claimed Gabe's life. What else could I tell them? The truth would have destroyed what remained of our careers, our sanity. We tried to go back to our lives, to pretend that nothing had happened. Marissa dropped out of the program and disappeared. I heard later that she'd moved to Alaska, as far from the desert as she could get. But the whispers never left us. They followed us, haunting our dreams, a constant reminder of the darkness we'd uncovered, the evil we'd awakened. And sometimes, late at night, I hear them calling my name, soft and insistent, echoing through the silence of my empty house. Dr. Collins, come back. See, I know they're waiting for me, out there in the desert, their hollow eyes watching, their twisted hands reaching. They want me to return, to join them in the darkness, to become one with the ancient horror that lurks among the petroglyphs. The same horror that humans have been carving warnings about for thousands of years. If only we'd known how to read them. And I know, someday, I won't be able to resist. The pull grows stronger every day, the whispers more insistent. Sometimes I catch myself looking up flights to Arizona, my fingers hovering over the book button before I can stop myself. Because that's the true horror of the hollowed stones. Not that they kill you, but that they make you want to come back. They make you yearn for that terrible enlightenment, that awful knowledge that waits in the darkness. The desert is patient. It can wait. And when I finally return, I know I'll find Gabe there. His empty eyes watching, his twisted smile welcoming me home. After all, some mysteries are meant to stay buried. Some knowledge is meant to remain hidden. But once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. There's only the whispers and the waiting and the inevitable return to the hollowed stones. Ayako had always been drawn to eerie places, a fascination that began in her childhood when she would spend hours exploring abandoned shrines near her grandmother's house in rural Hokkaido. The crumbling stone structures and weathered torii gates had sparked something in her young mind. A deep appreciation for places where the veil between the mundane and mysterious grew thin. Now, as a professional photographer specializing in documenting Japan's forgotten and haunted locations, she found herself drawn to the ultimate canvas for her art, Aokigahara Forest. The infamous forest, nestled at the northwest base of Mount Fuji, had claimed hundreds of lives over the decades. Locals called it the Sea of Trees. But to Ayako, who had spent months researching its dark history for her photography project on Japan's haunted landscapes, it felt more like a cemetery for lost souls. Each tree, with its twisted trunk and gnarled branches reaching toward the dense canopy above, seemed to hold countless untold stories of despair and loss. She had interviewed dozens of people before making this trip. Local officials who conducted annual searches through the forest, elderly residents who spoke of ancient legends, and even a few individuals who had attempted to take their lives there, but had somehow found their way back. Their stories had painted a picture of a place that existed somewhere between reality and nightmare, a realm where the rules of the natural world seemed to bend and break. The morning of her shoot arrived with a heavy mist that clung to the ground like a burial shroud. Ayako parked her car at the forest's designated lot, her hands trembling slightly as she checked her camera equipment one final time. She had brought her best gear, a professional-grade digital camera with multiple lenses, designed to capture both sweeping landscapes and intimate details. The weight of the camera bag on her shoulder felt reassuring, anchoring her to reality as she took her first steps into the forest. The ground beneath her boots was damp and soft, decades of fallen leaves forming a thick, springy carpet that seemed to absorb every sound. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the rich scent of wet earth and pine needles. Moss-covered stones dotted the landscape, their ancient surfaces telling silent stories of centuries past. This was exactly the atmosphere she had hoped to capture, the ethereal beauty that made Aokigahara's darkness all the more haunting. She began her work methodically, each shot carefully composed to capture the forest's silent majesty. The dense canopy above filtered the morning sunlight, creating an otherworldly play of light and shadow. Beams of light pierced through gaps in the foliage like spotlights, illuminating patches of mist that drifted like lost spirits through the trees. The forest seemed to breathe around her, alive with a presence that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. As hours passed and she ventured deeper into Aokigahara, the silence became almost physical, a presence that pressed against her eardrums and made her own heartbeat sound thunderous. She had read extensively about the forest's unusual acoustic properties, how its volcanic soil and dense vegetation absorbed sound to create an unnatural stillness. But experiencing it firsthand was different. Each click of her camera's shutter felt like a violation, an intrusion into something ancient and sacred. The first strange photo appeared around midday. She was reviewing her shots, scanning through the images on her camera's LCD screen, when something caught her eye. In the background of one frame, partially obscured by a twisted branch, was a face. At first, she dismissed it as pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. But as she zoomed in, the details became unmistakable. Hollow eyes, gaunt cheeks, and an expression of profound sorrow that seemed to stare directly into the lens. Her professional instincts kicked in, and she began cross-referencing the face with mental images from her research. It bore a striking resemblance to Tanaka Hiroshi, a businessman who had disappeared in the forest 3 years ago. His case had made headlines because of the mysterious circumstances. His car had been found in the parking lot, but despite extensive searches, his body was never recovered. Trying to maintain her composure, Ayako continued shooting, but now each review of her photos revealed more faces among the trees. They appeared like water stains on old photographs, faint at first, then gradually becoming clearer, more defined. She recognized some of them from news reports and missing person posters. A young woman who had vanished in the spring of 2019, an elderly man whose family still visited the forest's edge every anniversary of his disappearance, a teenager whose school uniform had been found hanging from a branch, but whose body remained lost to the forest's depths. The temperature seemed to drop with each new discovery, the air growing thick with an oppressive cold that penetrated her jacket and settled into her bones. The mist that had been so picturesque in the morning now seemed menacing, writhing around the trees like living tendrils. Shadows deepened, pooling at the base of trees like dark water, and the forest's silence took on a waiting quality, as if holding its breath. Then came the photo that changed everything. As she reviewed another shot, her blood turned to ice. There, among the faces in the background, was her own. The image was clear enough to be unmistakable, her features perfectly rendered, but transformed by an expression she had never worn in life. Her eyes were hollow pits of darkness, her mouth slightly open as if in mid-whisper, and her skin had the same translucent quality as the other spectral faces that haunted her photographs. Panic surged through her body like an electric current. She looked up from the camera, scanning the forest around her, but the trees offered no answers. Only more shadows, more silence, more faces hidden in the patterns of bark and leaves. The forest seemed to have changed while she wasn't looking, the paths she had taken disappearing into the undergrowth, as if they had never existed. She turned to retrace her steps, but each direction looked identical, an endless sea of trees stretching into darkness. Her breathing became shallow and quick, her photographer's eye now working against her, as she began to see faces everywhere, in the knots of trees, in the patterns of moss, in the spaces between branches. Each face seemed more tortured than the last, their expressions a symphony of eternal sorrow. Desperately, she consulted her camera again, hoping to find some clue in the earlier photos that might lead her back. But as she scrolled through the images, her horror grew. Her own face appeared more frequently now, growing clearer and closer with each frame. In the latest photos, she could see subtle changes in her spectral reflection, her skin becoming more translucent, her eyes growing darker, her expression shifting from fear to a strange, peaceful acceptance. The first whisper came like a breath of wind through the trees, so faint she almost missed it. But then it came again, stronger this time, and she recognized it with a jolt of terror. It was her own voice, calling her name. Ayako. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the trees with an unnatural resonance. Other voices joined in, a chorus of whispers that spoke of peace and rest, of joining them in their eternal vigil among the trees. She recognized some of them, voices she had heard in video interviews during her research, now transformed into ghostly echoes. Ayako, stay with us. Her legs felt heavy, as if the forest floor itself was trying to claim her. The mist swirled more actively now, forming shapes that almost looked human before dissolving back into formless vapor. She stumbled into a small clearing, where a pool of collected rainwater reflected the canopy above. But when she looked down, the reflection showed more than just trees. It showed faces, dozens of them, hundreds, all staring up at her with the same hollow eyes she had seen in her photos. And there, in the center of the pool, was her own reflection, but not as she was now. Instead, she saw herself as she appeared in the photos, spectral and transformed, a being caught between worlds. The reflection didn't move with her, instead maintaining its own terrible stillness, its dark eyes boring into her with an intensity that spoke of ancient hungers and eternal loneliness. She tried to run, but her body refused to respond, held in place by an invisible force that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath her feet. The voices grew louder, more insistent, a cacophony of whispers that filled her mind until her own thoughts were drowning in their collective murmur. They spoke of belonging, of becoming part of something eternal, of finding peace in the endless silence of Aokigahara. Join us, Ayako. Become one with the forest. The darkness began to creep in from the edges of her vision, not like the darkness of unconsciousness, but like something alive, something hungry. She felt it seeping into her skin, filling her lungs with each breath, transforming her from the inside out. Her camera slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering to the forest floor, its screen still showing that last terrible image of her transformed self. In her final moments of consciousness, Ayako understood the true nature of Aokigahara. It wasn't just a place where people came to die. It was a living entity, ancient and patient, that collected souls like a child might collect butterflies. Each face in the trees was another addition to its terrible gallery, another consciousness absorbed into its eternal silence. She felt herself beginning to fade, her physical form becoming less substantial with each passing second. The forest's presence filled her completely now, replacing her blood with sap, her bones with wood, her thoughts with the collective whispers of all those who had come before. Her last human act was to reach out toward her fallen camera, but her hand had already become translucent, merging with the mist that swirled through the trees. And then she was gone, or rather, transformed. Her consciousness dispersed like morning dew, becoming one with the forest's ancient awareness. Her face joined the others hidden in the bark and leaves. Her voice became part of the whispered chorus that called to other lost souls. And her story became just another legend in the dark history of Aokigahara. The camera lay where it had fallen, its screen dark and silent. But in its memory card, preserved in perfect digital clarity, were the photos that documented Ayako's transformation. A series of images that showed a woman's gradual dissolution into the forest's hungry embrace. And in every photo, growing clearer and closer with each frame, was her face among the trees, forever watching, forever waiting, forever part of the endless silence of the sea of trees. Sarah had always thought of herself as a practical person, the kind who made lists, planned ahead, and never let emotions cloud her judgment. Moving into her own apartment a year ago had been her way of proving she could take care of herself, that she didn't need her parents or anyone else constantly worrying. The decision had come after months of careful research, savings calculations, and numerous visits to different neighborhoods. The building she chose was modest, a 6-story complex in a quiet neighborhood where most residents kept to themselves. The brick facade was weathered but well maintained, the lobby clean if somewhat dated. She had chosen it specifically for its unremarkable nature, thinking it would be the perfect place to start her independent life. Even her parents had approved, her father noting the solid security doors and her mother commenting on the respectable-looking neighbors they'd seen during their visit. But over the past few weeks, strange things had started happening. Little things at first, so subtle she almost didn't notice them. A chair slightly out of place, the feeling of being watched while doing dishes at her kitchen window, the sound of footsteps that seemed to stop whenever she did. Sarah began to wonder if she'd made a mistake, if her desire for independence had led her into something darker than she'd anticipated. It began innocently enough, as most nightmares do. A few weeks ago, her landlord sent an email warning residents about an increase in break-ins in the neighborhood. The message appeared in her inbox on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between work memos and shopping newsletters. Nothing alarming, just a reminder to double-check locks and not to let strangers into the building. The email mentioned incidents in nearby complexes, though the details were vague. Something about doors being found unlocked, items missing from common areas. Being on the 4th floor had always made Sarah feel somewhat secure, high enough to be away from street-level threats, but not so high as to be isolated at the top. But something about that email stirred an unease she couldn't shake, like a shadow glimpsed from the corner of your eye. So, out of caution, she decided to install a peephole camera. It was a small, basic model she bought online after reading dozens of reviews and comparison articles. The device promised to send alerts to her phone whenever someone stood outside her door. The installation took less than 20 minutes, and Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction from taking such a practical security measure. She even sent a photo of the installed camera to her father, who praised her smart thinking. At first, the camera captured the ordinary rhythm of apartment life, neighbors passing by, the mailman dropping off packages, the occasional maintenance worker in his gray uniform. Sarah grew used to the periodic buzzing of her phone, each alert reassuring her that life in the building was proceeding as normal. Sometimes she'd catch glimpses of Mrs. Peterson from 4B walking her Yorkshire Terrier, Charlie, who always seemed to be wearing a new sweater. Or Mr. Martinez from 4D returning late from his night shift at the hospital, still in his scrubs. These familiar faces became a comfort, reminding her that she wasn't truly alone in the building, even if her apartment felt like an isolated bubble at times. Then one night, everything changed. She received an alert around 3 a.m., that dead hour when even the city seemed to hold its breath. Sarah was half asleep, curled under her comforter, when her phone's vibration cut through the silence like a knife. The blue light of the screen illuminated her bedroom, casting strange shadows on the walls. Groggily, she checked her phone and opened the app, expecting to see perhaps a late-night resident, or maybe even a stray cat that had somehow gotten into the building. But the footage showed something that made her blood run cold. A figure stood directly outside her door, facing the peephole, their face hidden under a dark hood. The hallway's fluorescent lights cast strange shadows across them, making them appear almost otherworldly, like a specter caught on camera. They didn't knock or move, just stood there, staring directly into the camera, as if they knew she was watching. The way they positioned themselves, perfectly centered in the frame, seemed deliberate, calculated. This wasn't someone who'd simply stopped at the wrong door, or a drunk neighbor who had lost their way. This was something else entirely. Sarah's stomach clenched as she replayed the footage, trying to make out any distinguishing features. The person remained there, motionless, for almost 2 minutes before finally walking away, their movements smooth and unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. She deleted the footage, telling herself it was probably just a random person confused in the middle of the night. But the image of that hooded figure lingered, burning itself into her memory like an old photograph left too long in the sun. The next night, it happened again. This time, Sarah was awake, sitting in her reading chair, trying to distract herself with a book she couldn't focus on. The words seemed to blur together, her mind constantly drifting to thoughts of the figure. She heard faint shuffling outside her door, a sound so quiet she might have missed it if she hadn't been listening for it, and her phone buzzed a second later. Her hand shook as she checked the footage, seeing the same figure, closer to the camera now, their face mere inches from the lens. It felt as though they were staring right through her, through the digital barrier, through the solid wood of her door, straight into her soul. This time, the proximity revealed more details, a hood made of some dark material that seemed to absorb light, and beneath it, the faint outline of a pale jaw, smooth and almost feminine in its contours. She wanted to tell someone, but what could she say? How could she explain that she was being watched by a shadow? That someone was standing outside her door in the middle of the night, neither threatening nor harmless, just watching? She barely had any details to give, and besides, what would the police do? There was no crime in standing in a public hallway. Instead, she convinced herself that it would stop on its own. Maybe they were just lost, confused, or playing some kind of twisted game. She tried to rationalize it, to find some logical explanation that would allow her to sleep at night. But 2 nights later, it escalated, shattering any hope of normalcy. She had fallen asleep on the couch watching a movie, some romantic comedy she'd put on for background noise. The blue light of the TV cast odd shadows on her walls, making familiar objects look strange and distorted. Around 2 a.m., she jolted awake, her phone buzzing with another alert. Heart pounding, she opened the app, dreading what she'd see. And there it was, the hooded figure, again outside her door. But this time, they held something up to the camera, a crumpled piece of paper. Through the grainy footage, she could make out the words scrawled across it. "I can see you too." Sarah dropped her phone, feeling a chill wash over her entire body. They knew she was watching. They were playing with her, acknowledging the twisted connection between them through the very device she'd installed for protection. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her security measure had become a channel for terror, a way for this stranger to reach directly into her life. She wanted to call the police, but her voice caught in her throat. What could she tell them? That someone was leaving her notes in a public hallway? That they were standing still in a space they had every right to be in? She sat there, heart hammering, watching the door, terrified that at any moment it would creak open. Every sound in the apartment became amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, distant traffic, the faint settling of the building. Each one could be footsteps, could be someone trying to get in. The next morning, she went straight to the building manager, Mike. She found him in his tiny office off the lobby, surrounded by maintenance requests and outdated tenant files. She told him everything, how someone had been outside her door at night, leaving messages. He listened, but his expression was skeptical. That patronizing look she'd grown accustomed to as a woman living alone. "Are you sure it wasn't a friend playing a prank?" he asked, barely looking up from his desk, his coffee mug leaving rings on whatever paper he was pretending to read. Sarah insisted, but he simply nodded, promising to look into it in a tone that suggested he'd do nothing of the sort. She left feeling humiliated, like she'd overreacted, just another young woman jumping at shadows. But the alerts didn't stop. The growing dread continued to fill her apartment like thick fog, seeping into every corner, every moment of her day. The visits persisted, almost nightly, always around 3 a.m., that witching hour when the barrier between reality and nightmare seemed thinnest. Sometimes the figure stood there for only a few seconds. Other times, they lingered for minutes, perfectly still, waiting, as if expecting her to react. They never knocked, never spoke. But one morning, she opened her door to find a small silver key resting on her doormat, identical to her apartment key, down to the slight wear mark on the edge where it caught on her key ring. Sarah backed away, fear crawling up her spine like ice water. How had they copied her key? When had they gotten close enough to make an impression? She picked it up with shaking hands, locking her door and checking the peephole obsessively. The hallway was empty, but it no longer felt safe. That space beyond her door had become alien territory, hostile and threatening. She didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a threat. Shadows seemed deeper, more menacing, as if they could hide someone or something. She lay in bed, clutching her phone, ready to call for help at the slightest sign of trouble. The hours dragged by, each minute stretched thin with tension. Finally, around 4 a.m., her phone buzzed. With dread, she opened the app and saw the familiar grainy footage. The figure was back, but this time, they did something different. They raised a hand and gently, almost lovingly, stroked the doorframe. The gesture was intimate, possessive, like a lover's caress. Then they leaned in, so close she could make out the shape of their lips as they whispered something, just a soft, hoarse sound that sent chills down her spine. The camera's microphone barely picked it up, but the words seemed to echo in her mind. And then, as if sensing her terror, they held up another note. This one read, "Let me in." The handwriting was neat, almost beautiful, which somehow made it more terrifying. This wasn't the work of some random vandal or confused drunk. This was deliberate, calculated, personal. Someone who took their time, who planned each move, each message. That was it. She couldn't take it anymore. The fear had become a living thing, squeezing tighter each day, making it hard to breathe, to think, to live. The next day, she installed new locks, adding a bolt to the door with shaking hands. The hardware store clerk had asked if she needed help installing them, but Sarah couldn't bear the thought of letting anyone else into her space. She stopped sleeping at night, instead sitting up with every light on, listening for signs of their return. The darkness outside her windows felt alive, pregnant with malevolent possibilities. For a few nights the alerts stopped, and she started to believe it was over, that they had perhaps grown bored and moved on. But then, she found the note. It was taped to the wall, just outside her door. "I know where you sleep." The words seemed to pulse in the harsh hallway light, a simple message that spoke volumes about how much they knew, how close they'd gotten. She spent that night curled in a corner of her bedroom, clutching her phone and waiting for the next alert, knowing it would come, but hoping desperately that it wouldn't. Finally, just before dawn, her phone vibrated with a new notification. She didn't want to look, but some primal need to know urged her on. The camera feed showed her hallway, empty, but with the camera itself angled downward, as if someone had touched it. Then, as she watched, the screen flickered, and a hand reached toward the lens. A pale, slender hand, with fingers that moved with deliberate grace. The feed cut to black, leaving her alone in the silence of her apartment. Numb, she stared at the blank screen. The camera that had been her window to the world was gone, leaving her blind to whatever waited outside. She must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion, because, when she awoke, the apartment was dark, the silence thick and oppressive. Suddenly she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the peephole, each tap slow and precise, like a countdown. Sarah rose from the couch, feeling her legs tremble beneath her. She forced herself to the door, pressing her eye to the peephole, knowing she shouldn't but unable to resist. The hallway was empty, the fluorescent lights casting their sickly glow on vacant space. But then she saw it, a faint smudge on the outside of the lens, like someone had pressed their lips against the peephole, leaving behind a perfect impression. She stumbled back, a scream caught in her throat, her apartment now feeling like a cage rather than a sanctuary. Frantically, she dialed 911, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what was happening. The police arrived minutes later, but they found no sign of her stalker, no evidence of the terror that had been building for weeks. They took her statement and assured her they'd keep watch, their words hollow in the empty hallway. But as they left, Sarah noticed something that made her blood freeze. A single silver key on her doormat, identical to her own. A reminder that no matter what precautions she took, no matter how many locks she changed or police reports she filed, they could always get in. She doesn't sleep anymore. Each night she sits up clutching her phone, waiting for the next alert, the next note, the next knock. The darkness feels alive around her, and every shadow could hide a hooded figure. She knows it's only a matter of time before she hears those words again. I can see you too. And sometimes, in the deepest part of night, when the silence stretches thin and the shadows grow long, she wonders if they've already found their way in, if they're watching her right now, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the darkness and into her world. After all, they have the key. Carly adjusted her rearview mirror, eyeing the dusty trail that wound back toward the main road. Her fingers trembled slightly as she made the adjustment, a subtle manifestation of the anxiety that had been building since they decided to make this trip. The remote lake cabin she and her husband Brian had rented was already receding into the distance, swallowed by dense evergreens that seemed almost predatory in their reach. They were miles away from the closest town, tucked deep within a forest that had stood sentinel for centuries. The isolation was absolute. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no lifeline to the outside world. Carly couldn't help but feel a pang of nervousness as the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches casting shifting shadows across the windshield. Brian reached over, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. His wedding ring caught the filtered sunlight, a brief glimmer that reminded her of happier times. "This is going to be good for us," he said, his voice filled with optimism she hadn't heard in months. That spark of hope in his tone made her heart ache. It had been so long since she'd heard him sound like the man she'd fallen in love with. Just the two of us. No distractions. She managed a smile, squeezing his hand back, noting how unfamiliar the gesture felt after months of careful distance. She hoped he was right. After years of small arguments growing into deep wounds, petty disagreements festering into silent resentment, they both knew they were on the edge. Every conversation had become a minefield, every silence heavy with unspoken accusations. This weekend was a last attempt to mend things, away from work, away from friends, away from the familiar routines that had numbed them both into a hollow existence of parallel lives. When they arrived, Carly was relieved to see that the cabin was as beautiful as the photos had promised, though something about its isolation made it seem both inviting and somehow threatening. It sat right at the edge of a clear, still lake, the water shimmering under the early autumn sun like polished glass. The trees were just beginning to turn, their leaves casting a vibrant mix of orange, yellow, and red reflections on the water's surface. Nature's own kaleidoscope. The cabin itself was modest, but cozy, with a wraparound porch that creaked softly under their feet, and large picture windows that offered an unobstructed view of the lake. It felt like a postcard, almost too perfect to be real. Brian grabbed their bags from the car, his smile widening as he looked around, his earlier enthusiasm seemingly vindicated by the cabin's charm. "This is exactly what we needed. Look at that view, Car." The old nickname slipped out naturally, and for a moment, it was like they'd stepped back in time, before the arguments, before the silence. She looked out at the lake, letting herself relax for the first time in what felt like forever. The water was so still, it looked like a mirror, reflecting the sky above with perfect clarity. Maybe this could work. Maybe they could work. The thought carried both hope and fear. Hope that they could find their way back to each other, fear that they might discover there was nothing left to save. Inside, they found the cabin clean and well-stocked, with an old-fashioned charm that Carly found endearing, though something about the aged wooden walls made her feel like they were being watched. It had vintage wooden furniture, each piece telling its own story through worn edges and subtle marks, soft rugs that muffled their footsteps, and a large stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The owners had left a note welcoming them and a logbook with the cabin's history, a charming touch, Carly thought, flipping through the yellowed pages as Brian unpacked. "It's all local families who stayed here," she said, running her finger down the faded entries. "Seems like a lot of people used to come up here to escape from the city." She noticed that some of the entries stopped abruptly, with no mention of departure dates, but she pushed the observation aside. "Can't blame them," Brian said, leaning over her shoulder to look at the logbook, his chest pressing against her back in a familiar way that made her heart skip. "Maybe we'll leave our own mark." There was something in his tone that made her shiver, though she couldn't say why. They spent the day exploring the woods, walking along the shore, and sharing easy conversations that felt both natural and forced, like actors who knew their lines, but had forgotten the emotion behind them. Carly felt lighter than she had in months, laughing at Brian's bad jokes, feeling the tension between them ease, though something about the laughter seemed to echo strangely in the still air. They cooked dinner together in the small kitchen, the scent of pasta and fresh herbs filling the cabin, creating an illusion of domesticity that almost made her forget why they were here. That night, they settled in front of the large picture window, gazing out at the still lake as the sun set. The colors were breathtaking, a fiery blaze of reds and purples casting an otherworldly glow on the water. The lake seemed to absorb the light, transforming it into something deeper, more mysterious. Carly shifted, glancing at Brian's reflection in the glass. She was about to tell him how beautiful it all was, when she noticed something strange. His reflection was smiling, a wide, genuine smile she hadn't seen in years. But when she turned to look at him directly, his face was calm, contemplative, almost blank. She felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine like ice water. "Hey, Brian, were you just smiling?" He turned to her, looking confused, his brow furrowing in that way she used to find endearing. "No, just watching the view." "Why?" "Oh, nothing," she said, trying to laugh it off, though the sound came out strained and hollow. "I thought I saw you smile in the reflection, that's all." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken uncertainty. Brian shrugged, but Carly noticed the way his eyes lingered on the window for a moment longer, as if searching for something in the darkening glass. She tried to brush off the feeling, telling herself she was just tired from the drive, but something about the way the reflection had looked, so real, so genuine, stayed with her. The next morning, she awoke to find Brian standing in front of the same window, staring intently at his own reflection. The early morning light cast strange shadows across his face, making him look older, somehow different. "Hey," she called, sleepily rubbing her eyes, trying to shake off the unsettling dreams that had plagued her sleep. "You're up early." He turned, a strange look on his face that made her stomach clench. "Did you notice anything odd about the reflection last night?" A chill prickled up her spine, and she felt the hair on her arms stand on end. "You saw it too?" He nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "When you looked away, I swear I saw you in the reflection, looking different, like you were sad or something. But not just sad. It was like looking at you from years ago, when things first started going wrong." They exchanged a look, each sensing the other's unease, each recognizing the weight of what remained unsaid. Carly laughed nervously, the sound brittle in the morning quiet. "I'm sure it's nothing. Just our minds playing tricks on us. You know, being in a new place and all." Brian nodded, but Carly could see the tension hadn't left his face, and could read the doubt in his eyes. They both tried to shake it off, filling the day with more hikes, fishing by the lake, and exploring the woods around the cabin. But there was a new awareness between them, a heightened sensitivity to every reflection, every glimpse of themselves in windows and water. But that night, the reflections returned with a vengeance. As they sat by the fire, sharing a bottle of wine, Carly caught sight of the window again. In the reflection, Brian was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen in years. A soft, loving gaze that took her breath away, the same look he'd given her on their wedding day. She turned to him, ready to thank him for the look, but he was staring at the flames, his face lost in thought, showing none of the tenderness she'd seen in the reflection. She swallowed hard, a feeling of dread settling in her stomach like lead. "Brian, do you feel like the reflections are trying to show us something?" He nodded slowly, glancing over at the window, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "Maybe it's just the light, or the way the cabin is set up. Old glass can warp, you know." But his voice lacked conviction, and they both knew he was grasping at rational explanations for something that defied rationality. But they both knew it wasn't just the glass. As the days went on, the reflections grew more vivid, more disturbing, as if the cabin itself was trying to force them to confront something they'd been avoiding for years. One morning, Carly saw herself crying in the reflection, tears streaming down her face, even though she was smiling in reality. Another time, she saw Brian with an expression of pure, unfiltered rage, something he'd never shown in real life, but something she'd always feared lurked beneath his careful control. Each night, the reflections grew more intense, each one revealing darker and deeper emotions, like layers of an onion being peeled away to reveal the rot beneath. And then came the night when she saw it, the moment that would change everything. They were eating dinner, the cabin silent except for the soft clinking of forks and the crackling fire. The tension between them had grown thick enough to cut with a knife, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. Carly glanced up at the window, but the reflection was no longer showing them as they were now. Instead, she saw herself and Brian from years ago, sitting in their old apartment, both of them silent, the air thick with unspoken resentment. She saw the moment when things began to crack, when love started to curdle into something bitter and cold. She felt a wave of anger rise up, the memory of that argument as sharp as if it were happening again. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing to the reflection with a trembling finger. Brian looked up, his eyes widening as he saw it too. The image of their younger selves, caught in a moment of despair that had never truly ended. He stood abruptly, shoving his chair back with a screech that seemed to echo through the cabin. "This isn't right. It's like this place is trying to make us remember things we've buried, things we never wanted to face." They both backed away from the window, the eerie reflection flickering like a scene from a broken memory, showing them versions of themselves they'd tried to forget. That night, neither of them slept, lying awake in the darkness, listening to the sound of their own breathing, and wondering what other truths the cabin would force them to confront. The final night, Carly's nerves were shot, her body tense and jittery with exhaustion and fear. She and Brian had barely spoken all day, the weight of the reflections hanging over them like a dark cloud. She could feel something building, something inevitable and dangerous, like a storm gathering strength before it breaks. That night, as they sat by the fire, Brian's reflection twisted into something she didn't recognize. His eyes were dark, his expression twisted with anger and accusation, showing her the face of a stranger wearing her husband's features. The reflection seemed to pulse with its own life, its own agenda. Carly's hands trembled as she looked back at him, her voice barely a whisper in the oppressive silence. "What's happening to us, Brian? Why is this place doing this?" He looked at her, his face weary and haunted, aged by the weight of everything they'd seen. I don't know. Maybe it's showing us something we never wanted to face. All the things we've been hiding from each other, from ourselves. Their voices escalated, the tension and resentment they'd been carrying for years finally surfacing. But this time, it felt sharper, more real, as if the reflections were feeding on their anger, amplifying it, turning it into something monstrous and uncontrollable. Carly glanced at the window, feeling a surge of dread as she saw herself in the reflection, screaming, her face contorted in rage she couldn't control. Her reflection pounded on the glass, furious, as if it wanted to break through and take her place, as if it was trying to show her what she'd become, or what she might become if they stayed. She staggered back, grabbing Brian's arm with desperate strength. "We need to leave. Now." The words came out in a rush, driven by pure survival instinct. They packed in silence, their movements frantic and panicked. Carly felt the reflections watching them, waiting, as if they didn't want them to go, as if the cabin itself was trying to keep them trapped in this nightmare of confrontation and revelation. As they reached the door, she glanced back one last time and froze, her heart stopping in her chest. In the window, their reflections weren't leaving. They were standing still, faces twisted in expressions of rage, sadness, and betrayal that seemed to contain every negative emotion they'd ever felt toward each other. Her own reflection looked at her with a hollow, empty gaze, mouthing words she couldn't hear but understood in her soul. Warnings, perhaps, or prophecies of what was to come. Brian pulled her arm, his grip painful but grounding. "Don't look back." His voice was rough with fear and something else, recognition, perhaps, of how close they'd come to losing themselves in those reflections. They fled into the night, the shadows of the forest pressing in around them as they stumbled down the path. Carly felt as if the reflections were reaching out, desperate to pull them back, to keep them trapped in that cabin forever, forced to confront every painful truth they'd ever hidden. When they finally reached the car, they didn't speak. They drove in silence, neither of them daring to look back at the cabin or the windows that had shown them too much truth. The darkness seemed to follow them, clinging to their car like a shroud. They never talked about what they saw that weekend, each trying to bury it, to forget. But every time Carly looked in a mirror, every time she caught her own reflection, she saw a hint of that hollow, haunted gaze, as if the cabin had left a part of itself inside her, a permanent reminder of the truths they'd tried to escape. And sometimes, when she looked closely, she swore she saw her reflection staring back at her with a knowing smile, a reminder of what she'd left behind in that cabin by the lake, and what might still be waiting for them there, in the depths of those perfect reflections, should they ever dare to return. In the years that followed, they worked to rebuild their marriage, but they never stayed anywhere with large windows, and they never, ever looked too long at their reflections, afraid of what truths might still be waiting to emerge from the other side of the glass. Mara pulled into Maple Hill in early autumn, her old Honda Civic winding through streets drenched in the warm hues of changing leaves. Sugar maples lined the sidewalks, their branches forming golden arches that seemed to welcome her into town. She'd been drawn to Maple Hill's quiet charm and affordable rent after her recent breakup with Alex, 6 years ending with a text message and an empty apartment in Boston. A fresh start was exactly what she needed, and this picturesque New England town seemed to offer exactly that. She'd found the rental listing online, a small, cozy apartment on the top floor of a Victorian house, complete with dormer windows and gingerbread trim painted in fading shades of blue and white. The Olivers, who owned the house and lived downstairs, had seemed almost too perfect during her viewing. Harold with his neat bow ties and carefully trimmed mustache, Martha with her flour-dusted apron and warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The rent was suspiciously low for such a beautiful place, but Mara had been too relieved to question it. Her savings had taken a hit after the breakup, and teaching jobs were hard to come by mid-semester. When the Olivers had offered her the apartment on the spot, she'd signed the lease immediately, ignoring the slight tremor in Martha's hand as she held out the pen. Maple Hill seemed perfect on the surface. Quaint shops lined the main street, each filled with handmade crafts, locally grown produce, and seasonal decorations. The coffee shop served perfect lattes in mismatched mugs, and the bookstore had reading nooks that seemed designed for losing yourself for hours. People greeted her with polite smiles. Neighbors waved from their porches, and there was an easy rhythm to life in the town that made her feel like she belonged. But one night, about a week after moving in, she noticed something strange. Mara had been unpacking boxes in her living room, sorting through the debris of her old life. Books Alex had given her, destined for donation. Photo albums she couldn't bring herself to open. Coffee mugs from their travels together. The familiar task had almost distracted her from noticing the unusual silence from downstairs. The Olivers were usually active in the evenings. She'd grown accustomed to their routines. Harold's shuffling footsteps, Martha's gentle humming, the clinking of dishes in the kitchen, the low hum of Jeopardy, drifting up through the old heating vents. But tonight, there was silence. She dismissed it at first, assuming they were out visiting friends or running errands. The Olivers often mentioned their involvement in various town committees and social groups, though Mara had noticed they never specified which ones. But as the evening wore on, the silence began to feel heavy, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on the old house. The next morning, when she went down to ask Mrs. Oliver about an electric bill that had arrived in their name, there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, but the house remained still. The silence had a different quality in daylight, less mysterious, more unsettling. Concerned, she tried calling their phone, but it went straight to voicemail, Mrs. Oliver's cheerful voice asking her to leave a message they would never retrieve. Oddly enough, the Olivers' car was still parked in the driveway, a sensible blue Volvo with a small garden gnome air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. She peered through the windows, catching glimpses of their furniture through the lace curtains, Harold's favorite armchair, the collection of antique teacups Martha had proudly shown her, family photos on the walls, whose subjects seemed to stare back at her with knowing eyes. But there was no sign of either Oliver. After a day of unanswered calls and no signs of movement, Mara decided to bring it up with her neighbor, Mrs. Hatch, an elderly woman who often sat on her porch, knitting and watching the street with sharp, observant eyes. Mrs. Hatch seemed to know everything about everyone in Maple Hill, though Mara had noticed she never actually spoke to anyone, except to offer cryptic observations about the weather. "Oh, don't worry yourself," Mrs. Hatch said, her knitting needles clicking together like tiny bones as a peculiar smile flickered across her face. "People come and go all the time in Maple Hill. It's part of the charm." Mara's brow furrowed, her unease growing. "But their car is still here, and I haven't seen them since yesterday. They didn't say anything about leaving. Shouldn't we call someone? The police, maybe?" Mrs. Hatch's needles stopped their rhythmic movement for just a moment, her smile tightening at the corners. "It's best not to ask too many questions, dear. Folks here like their privacy. And the police, well, they understand how things work in Maple Hill." The answer left Mara deeply unsettled. She thanked Mrs. Hatch and returned to her apartment, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at her bones. But as the day wore on, her worry grew. She'd never known the Olivers to leave without a word. They were private, yes, but not rude. And their absence had left a strange silence in the house that made her feel oddly exposed, as if the empty rooms below were somehow watching her. Over the next few days, Mara continued asking around, bringing up the Olivers in casual conversation at the coffee shop, the grocery store, even the small art gallery where she'd taken to spending her afternoons. But her inquiries were always met with the same tight-lipped response. Some people offered sympathetic nods, others avoided eye contact, and a few seemed to look at her with something akin to pity, or perhaps anticipation. And that was when she noticed something chilling. In every interaction, she caught a common refrain. People in Maple Hill seemed to disappear with alarming regularity, and no one wanted to talk about it. More unsettling, she realized, was that everyone seemed to expect it. A woman at the bakery mentioned how her previous assistant moved on without notice. The young man at the post office talked about his neighbors deciding to leave suddenly. Even the gas station clerk made an odd comment about how some folks just aren't meant to stay in Maple Hill. It was as if everyone in town shared some unspoken understanding that no one would acknowledge directly. And the more she listened, the clearer it became that the town didn't just tolerate these disappearances. They depended on them, like a hungry creature requiring regular feeding. One evening, while searching for answers, Mara decided to check the town's archives in the small public library. The building itself was a Victorian mansion, converted for public use, its rooms still bearing the whispers of its original purpose. She explained to the librarian, a frail woman named Agnes whose wire-rimmed glasses magnified her pale eyes to an unsettling degree, that she was interested in learning more about the history of the house she rented. Agnes gave her a knowing look but didn't question it, leading her to a room filled with microfiche readers and carefully preserved newspapers. "Be careful what you go looking for," she said softly, before leaving Mara alone among the dusty records. Some answers aren't meant to be found. Sifting through old newspaper clippings and town records, Mara's unease grew with each page she turned. She found articles dating back decades, each one documenting the sudden, unexplained departure of entire families. The articles were brief, almost casual, with statements that began to feel like a macabre pattern. The Anderson family decided to move unexpectedly, or the Millers left town without saying goodbye. Some included photos of the families, smiling faces that seemed to hold a hint of fear in their eyes, as if they knew what was coming. Each case seemed to follow the same pattern. Families vanished without notice, their homes left eerily untouched, and their vehicles abandoned in driveways or parking lots. And the chilling part? Every article was dated almost exactly 1 year apart, as regular as the changing of seasons. Mara's hands shook as she pieced it all together, the truth forming like frost on a window. The Olivers were the latest in a long line of disappearances, just the most recent casualties of Maple Hill's strange tradition. But why? What was it about this town that demanded a family vanish every year, like some dark harvest? As she gathered her things to leave, Agnes approached her, her expression grim in the library's dimming light. "You should go home now, Mara," she said, her voice low and urgent. "This town isn't a place for digging. Some secrets need to stay buried." That night, Mara couldn't sleep. Her mind raced, replaying the faces of everyone she'd spoken to, the eerie expressions, the sympathetic looks, the warnings. She remembered Mrs. Hatch's words. "People come and go all the time in Maple Hill." She realized then that the town didn't just ignore these disappearances, they orchestrated them. The next morning, as she went downstairs to grab her mail, she found something that made her blood run cold. A faded, worn journal sat on the doorstep, as if left there deliberately. It was old, its leather cover cracked and worn smooth around the edges, and the inside was filled with slanted, frantic handwriting. The entries were dated over several months, written by someone she didn't know but recognized immediately by the tone. Someone like her, someone who had tried to make sense of the disappearances. The writer described similar patterns, the silence from neighbors, the averted gazes, the way people seemed to watch certain houses with anticipation. They wrote about strange meetings in the town hall late at night, about whispered conversations that stopped when outsiders approached, about the way the town seemed to choose its victims carefully, always selecting those who wouldn't be missed by the outside world. The last entry, however, was the most disturbing. "We've started hearing footsteps at night, and someone's been watching the house from across the street. I told my husband we need to leave, but he insists we stay, that it's all just small-town paranoia. I'm scared. I think we might be next." The town has chosen us, and there's nothing we can do. They're waiting, always waiting, and soon." The entry was signed by Martha Oliver. Mara's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird, and her mind raced with implications. Had the Olivers left the journal as a warning? Or had someone else placed it there? Someone who wanted her to understand what was coming? She looked up at her empty apartment, a sudden, overwhelming dread filling her. She wasn't just a new resident in Maple Hill. She was the next person they'd been waiting for. The next sacrifice to whatever dark purpose kept this town alive. Determined to leave before whatever fate had befallen the others came for her, Mara packed her bags that night, loading her car in the cover of darkness. She didn't want anyone to know she was leaving. She just wanted out, away from this town with its perfect facade and rotting core. But as she put her final bag in the trunk, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. A group of people stood across the street, barely visible in the dim streetlight. Mrs. Hatch was among them. Her knitting needles still moving in her hands through her eyes, remained fixed on Mara. Agnes from the library stood beside her, along with the gas station clerk, the baker, and several others she recognized from her weeks in town. All watching, all waiting, their faces as blank and unchanging as carved wood. Mara's hands shook as she climbed into the driver's seat, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She turned the key, but the engine only clicked weakly, refusing to turn over. Panic surged through her as she tried again and again, her heart racing with each failed attempt. The sound seemed to echo in the unnaturally still night air, like a countdown to something inevitable. Then she saw Mrs. Hatch step forward, her face cold, her eyes unblinking in the streetlight. The others moved with her, a synchronized dance they had clearly performed before. "It's no use, dear," she said, her voice carrying over the silence with unnatural clarity. "This is Maple Hill. People don't leave without the town's permission, and you, my dear, have been chosen to stay. In your own special way." Mara felt her blood turn to ice as understanding dawned. She glanced around, looking for an escape, but the townspeople were closing in, forming a tight circle around her car. Their faces seemed to shift in the shadows, becoming something older, something hungry. She was trapped, caught in a web she hadn't even known she was walking into. The next morning, Maple Hill was quiet. The sun rose over the neat rows of houses, the streets empty, the air still with the crisp promise of approaching winter. A "for rent" sign hung in the window of Mara's apartment, swaying gently in the breeze that carried the scent of wood smoke and decay. And the townspeople went about their day as usual, their lives undisturbed, their smiles hiding secrets older than any memory. There was no mention of Mara, no sign that she'd ever been there. Just another empty home, waiting for the next resident to be drawn in by Maple Hill's deceptive charm. In the coming weeks, they'd have new visitors, people charmed by the town's quiet streets and warm autumn colors, by the affordable rent and friendly faces. And when they asked about the previous tenant, the townspeople would smile, their faces blank and unknowing, their eyes holding the same ancient hunger that had kept Maple Hill alive for generations. After all, people came and went in Maple Hill, and no one ever questioned where they went, only knowing that Maple Hill was a place where certain secrets stayed buried, where the town itself demanded regular tribute, and where the price of perfect small-town life was paid in disappeared souls. Mrs. Hatch still sits on her porch, knitting endless scarves that never seem to be finished, watching the streets with patient eyes. She knows another newcomer will arrive soon. They always do, and Maple Hill will be waiting, hungry for fresh stories to add to its collection, for new names to join the long list of those who came to start over and instead became part of the town's dark legacy. The sugar maples still line the streets, their leaves turning gold and red with each passing season. And somewhere beneath their roots, in spaces that don't appear on any map, the disappeared ones of Maple Hill wait in eternal silence, their stories forever entwined with the town that claimed them. It was the dead of night on a deserted Nevada highway when we first saw him. The moon hung low and bloated in the sky, casting an eerie silver light across the endless expanse of desert. Eric and I had been driving for hours, making our way from Los Angeles to Denver, taking the back roads to avoid traffic. We'd seen maybe 3 cars in the last 2 hours, each one a brief flash of headlights before disappearing into the darkness. The hitchhiker appeared as a silhouette on the shoulder, barely visible through the beams of our headlights, waving his arm with the desperate urgency of someone who hadn't seen another soul in hours. The temperature gauge on the dashboard read 42 degrees, unusually cold for a summer night in Nevada. I glanced at Eric in the driver's seat, my stomach twisting with uncertainty. We'd both heard the same warnings about picking up strangers, especially out here on lonely highways where help was hours away and cell service was non-existent. But as we got closer, I saw his face, a man, mid-40s, with a hollow expression that spoke of unimaginable horrors and clothes that looked like they'd been torn by something with sharp claws. His eyes held a kind of panic I'd never seen before, raw and primal, and something about it unnerved me to my core. There was dried blood on his shirt collar, though I couldn't see any obvious wounds. Before I could say anything, Eric slowed the car and stopped, the brakes squealing slightly in the silence. "Dude, I don't know," I muttered, eyeing the man's reflection in the side mirror. There was something off about the way he stood, like he was ready to bolt at any second. Eric shrugged, glancing at me with that easy confidence that had gotten us into trouble more than once during our college years. "He looks like he's in trouble. We can drop him off at the next station. Keep an eye on him if you're nervous." His voice was steady, but I noticed his hands were tight on the steering wheel. The man opened the door and slid into the back seat, closing it quietly behind him with an almost excessive care, as if making noise would attract something we couldn't see. The car's temperature seemed to drop several degrees the moment he entered. He didn't say thank you or tell us his name. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, glancing down the road behind us as if expecting someone, or something, to come barreling up the highway any second. "Where are you headed?" Eric asked, his voice echoing unnaturally in the sudden silence. "Doesn't matter. Just keep driving," the man whispered, his voice a scratchy rasp that reminded me of sandpaper on wood. "Don't stop. Don't turn around. Just keep going." His fingers drummed nervously on his knee, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo the beating of my heart. I felt a shiver run down my spine. His voice had that odd quality of someone who's been through something horrific, like war veterans I'd met who couldn't quite describe what they'd seen. "You okay, man?" I asked, turning to look at him. He flinched at my movement, his hands clenched around his knees so tight I could see his knuckles turning white. "Just drive. Please." His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the darkness outside the windows, as if searching for movement in the shadows. Eric and I exchanged a look, but we didn't say anything. The man's breathing was shallow and quick, like someone trying not to scream, and his face was pale as milk, a glistening sheen of sweat across his forehead despite the cold. Something had happened to him, something that had left him more terrified than any human should be, and we didn't want to know what it was. We drove in silence. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the faint whistle of wind outside the car. After half an hour, I glanced at the gas gauge, more out of habit than concern. My stomach dropped like a stone. "We're almost empty," I said quietly, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Eric glanced down, a frown creasing his forehead. "That's impossible. We filled up just an hour ago at that station in Beatty." He tapped the gauge with his finger, but the needle didn't move. I was about to say something, to suggest we turn back to the last town we'd passed, but the hitchhiker spoke first, his voice a low whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Whatever you do, don't stop," he said, eyes fixed on the road ahead, with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "If you stop, they'll know, and they'll come." A chill settled over the car, the kind of cold that doesn't come from the air conditioner but seeps straight into your bones. Eric looked at me, his face pale in the greenish glow from the dashboard, but he kept his foot on the gas, watching the road stretch out endlessly before us like a ribbon of black silk under the moon. We drove on, the gas gauge inching closer to empty with impossible speed, and that's when the static started. The radio, which had been off since we'd picked him up, Eric preferred to drive in silence at night, crackled to life, a low hum that filled the car like a living thing. I reached over to turn it off, but before I could touch the knob, a voice broke through the static. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but I recognized it instantly. It was my mother's voice. I froze, my hand hovering over the knob, my blood turning to ice in my veins. I hadn't heard her voice in years, not since she'd died in a car accident 5 years ago. She'd been on her way to visit me when she lost control of her car on a rainy stretch of highway, skidding off the road and into a ditch. They said she died instantly, but sometimes I wondered if she'd been afraid in those final moments. "Jeremy," the voice murmured, soft and familiar and wrong. "Jeremy, come home." A chill shot through me, freezing me in place. It couldn't be her. It just couldn't. The dead don't speak, I told myself. They don't call out to their sons through car radios on empty highways in the middle of nowhere. Beside me, Eric had gone rigid, his face pale as a sheet. He was staring at the radio, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel. And then, through the static, another voice broke through. A voice I didn't recognize, but one that filled me with an inexplicable dread, like hearing your own scream in a nightmare. "Turn around," the voice rasped, the words distorted and broken. "Turn around." The hitchhiker shifted in the back seat, his breathing quick and shallow like a trapped animal. "Ignore it," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Ignore everything. Just keep driving." Eric's hands were shaking now, his eyes flicking constantly to the mirrors, his face tight with fear. What is this?" he muttered, more to himself than to us. "It's them," the hitchhiker replied, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would draw attention to us. "The ones who live here, the ones who wait for people like us. They can't follow you if you keep moving. But if you stop..." His voice trailed off, his face a mask of terror that made my heart race. "Who are they?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. The hitchhiker's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror, and what I saw in them made my blood run cold. "The forgotten," he whispered. "The ones who disappeared out here, who never made it home. They're always hungry for company." I turned to look at Eric, who was staring at the road, his jaw clenched, his eyes focused and wide. "Drive," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Just drive." We drove in silence, the radio crackling in the background, the voices whispering, calling, begging us to turn around. But we didn't. We kept moving forward, mile after mile, the gas gauge sinking lower, the lights on the dash flickering like dying fireflies. Then, just as I began to think we were safe, I saw them. At first, they were just shadows, faint and indistinct, standing along the side of the road, their faces hidden in the darkness. And then, as we passed each one, they turned, watching us with hollow eyes that reflected our headlights like mirrors. Their faces were pale, twisted versions of human features, mouths hanging open in eternal screams. My heart pounded, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't say anything to Eric, didn't want him to know what I'd seen. But the hitchhiker saw the look on my face and nodded, his expression grim. "They're here," he murmured. "They're always here, waiting, watching, hungry." The static on the radio grew louder, the voices more insistent, a cacophony of whispers overlapping one another. voices I recognized and voices I didn't, all saying the same thing. Turn around, turn around, turn around. The gas gauge dropped to E with a quiet click that seemed to echo through the car like a gunshot. Eric cursed under his breath, his grip on the wheel so tight his knuckles went white. "We're almost out of gas," he said, his voice a whisper. "Doesn't matter," the hitchhiker replied, his voice barely audible over the static. "Just keep going. They can't take you if you keep moving." The engine sputtered, a faint shudder running through the car like a death rattle. My heart sank as I realized the inevitable truth. We were almost out of fuel, and there was nothing but darkness and empty roads stretching out ahead of us. The moon casting long shadows that seemed to reach for the car with ghostly fingers. "I can't keep going," Eric muttered, his face pale and drawn. "We're going to stall." The hitchhiker's face was a mask of terror, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Don't stop," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Whatever you do, don't stop. They're waiting for that. They're always waiting." But the car had other plans. With a final shudder that seemed to shake the very air around us, the engine died, the headlights flickering once before plunging us into darkness. Silence fell over the car, thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint crackle of static from the radio and our ragged breathing. Eric turned to me, his face pale in the dim light from the dashboard. "What now?" The hitchhiker didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the road, his face twisted in fear. And then, slowly, deliberately, he reached for the door handle. "What are you doing?" I whispered, panic rising in my throat. He didn't answer, opening the door and stepping out onto the road. I watched him in the rearview mirror as he stood there, staring into the darkness, his face pale and haunted in the moonlight. "They're coming," he murmured, his voice carrying clearly through the still air. "They're already here. They've been here all along." And that's when I saw them. Figures, emerging from the shadows like smoke given form. Their faces twisted and hollow, eyes empty and dark as the spaces between stars. They moved slowly, shambling toward the car with a terrible purpose, their expressions blank, mouths hanging open in silent screams that seemed to echo in my mind. The hitchhiker turned, his face pale as death. "I told you not to stop," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I told you. They always come when you stop." And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving us alone in the car, the figures drawing closer with each passing second. In the radio's static, I could hear my mother's voice again, clearer now, calling me home. Eric and I exchanged one final look, our faces pale, our hands shaking. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. We were trapped, alone on an endless highway, with the shadows closing in around us like a tide of darkness. The last thing I remember is the sound of static, the faint whispers growing louder and louder, filling the car, filling my mind, until there was nothing left but darkness and the endless chorus of voices calling us to turn around. And then, silence. They say that stretch of highway in Nevada is still empty, still dark, still waiting. And sometimes on moonlit nights, travelers report seeing 3 figures standing by the roadside, 2 young men and an older one, their faces hollow and pale, waving with desperate urgency for passing cars to stop. But no one stops anymore. No one can hear their warnings through the static.